Join Boise State Public Radio for a concert with blues guitarist and vocalist Coco Montoya at the Treefort Music Hall in Boise, February 13th. This concert is in honor of longtime KBSU DJ Arthur Ballinger, who is retiring after 47 years. Doors at 6, concert at 7 on the 13th of February for a night with Coco Montoya at the Treefort Music Hall. Details at boisestatepublicradio.org.
More Idaho Matters from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudette. Not that long ago, a literal carpet of black and orange butterflies would cover part of the United States every year as monarchs migrated in search of food. But over the past few decades, the number of these iconic creatures has dropped by 90%, and scientists have been sounding the alarm about their future. Well, last month, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service started the process to list monarchs as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Canada has already declared the butterflies as endangered. So joining us now to tell us more about monarchs and the proposal to protect them is Emma Pelton. She is a senior endangered species conservation biologist with the Xerces Society. Emma, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So Emma, can you remind us what the Xerces Society is?
We're a science-based nonprofit focused on supporting invertebrates and their habitats. And if invertebrate is a word that you forgot about back in high school or middle school science class, we're talking about animals without spines and mostly focused on freshwater mussels, snails, and the large diversity of insects.
So how much danger are butterflies in? I mean, how bad is this situation?
There are two major migratory populations in North America, and so I can talk a little bit about each of them. The eastern monarch migration is down over 80% from historic levels when monitoring began in the mid-1990s. And for the western population, the situation's more dire. This year alone, we're well over 99% decline from 1980s and early 1990 numbers when we saw low millions every year.
So do we know how many monarchs are left? I mean, can you figure that out by looking at the migration patterns?
Yeah, there's really kind of amazing monitoring programs, both in central Mexico, led by World Wildlife Fund Mexico and the federal government of Mexico. We see the numbers that come out from Mexico to be more of an estimate of the number of hectares of forest that the butterflies are using. And we expect to see this year's numbers come out in the next month or so. But we have heard anecdotally they're pretty far down this year in Mexico. And then in the West, we actually have this incredible community science-powered initiative that the Xerces Society runs. And we have over 400 volunteers and partners who actually go out with binoculars early in the morning at over 200 locations up and down the Pacific coast to count the number of butterflies. And we are literally counting in many cases or estimating. So this year, we just released our numbers, and there were less than 10,000 butterflies counted. And that, for comparison, last year we had over 200,000 butterflies at those same locations.
So they really have to travel quite a distance when they migrate. I mean, we're talking some days 100 miles a day. So with that said, what kind of threats do monarchs face in this migration process?
Because they have to migrate so far, they cross so many different landscapes. So when we think about the threats to insects or wildlife that are migratory, we're thinking about, urbanization. We're thinking about pesticide use. We're thinking about habitat loss. We're thinking about the effects of climate change, like drought, heat, wildfire. So really, I think of monarchs as an indicator or a flagship species for, how difficult it has become for a lot of migratory species, a lot of insects, a lot of migratory birds, to move across these various landscapes. And so that's both difficult, to talk about, tackling all these different challenges. And it also is really hopeful to me because it means that everybody can play a role and that there's actions we can take in urban areas, suburban areas, rural, natural areas, that will make a difference as they add up.
So can we talk about milkweed for a minute? Can you tell us what it is and why it's so important to monarch butterflies?
Yeah, milkweed has an unfortunate name. It definitely is considered a weed in some agricultural settings, and plenty of people have talked about, removing milkweed from fields back in the day. So it does do very well under, tilling and disking and kind of ground disturbing that happens in our agricultural fields. But it's also a species that is vital for monarchs because it is the only host plant, which means the only thing that their caterpillars can eat. So a female monarch lays an egg on a milkweed plant. There are over 70 species in North America, but there's a few that are the most common. So showy milkweed in the West is one of the most common milkweed species, and it's very similar to common milkweed in the East. So they look almost identical, and these again do very well under disturbance. And so that plant is what's vital. And then that caterpillar grows up, becomes an adult, and then as an adult, it can use a wide range of flowers, including milkweed, but including many native and non-native flowers for nectar and energy.
But milkweed's been disappearing, correct? Why is that?
Yeah, we have the strongest evidence of the dramatic decline of milkweed in upper Midwest farm fields in the 1990s and onward, as we really saw the introduction of genetically modified crops where you could apply herbicide to control weeds during the growing season. And so those crops, were genetically modified to be herbicide resistant, but not the milkweeds. So really strong evidence of a rapid decline in milkweed in those crop fields, in corn and soy in particular, in the 90s and early 2000s. In the West, it's a slightly different story. We definitely think about, a wider range of agricultural crops, not necessarily the same cropping systems that are a little more monoculture in, parts of Iowa where a lot of the studies took place. But we do say broadly, we've seen a decline of milkweed, and again, multifaceted changes in agriculture, urbanization, development, and just kind of a lesser tolerance of having weedy edges along, our fields, along our developed areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I need to know if this is true or not, but Americans, we love our avocados. I have been told that this is actually hurting the butterflies, and it's that demand that we have for it. Is that true?
I think the question is probably nuanced. And, I do
Okay.
think there's some evidence. I'm not an expert in kind of how avocado expansion in central Mexico does or doesn't kind of interact with monarch butterfly habitat. But my
Right.
understanding of it is that, yeah, sometimes we have seen, forests continue to be cleared for expansion of avocado plantations. That's not everywhere. So I do think it has depended on kind of the location. And I think the full scale of
Mm.
that impact, we don't quite know. So I do have to say, it's something that if you're able to buy, avocados that are grown in California, that can be a good alternative if you're concerned about that.
So, is the loss of these monarch butterflies a symptom of a wider environmental issue?
Yeah, I think this is where their role as a flagship species, they're one of the most iconic butterflies. They're widespread. They're something that I think a lot of people just connect to on a basic level, and maybe have stories or memories of, connecting and raising a caterpillar as a child. So just that
Mm-hmm.
alone, I think, speaks volumes. We do know monarchs are not in the worst shape of all Western butterflies, and there are a lot of other butterflies that are also need of attention. But the dramatic decline that we've seen in just a few decades in both the East and the West, I think, is one that kind of hits home, and people can kind of resonate with, oh, I don't see as many as I used to, or as many as when I was growing up. So I think that piece alone is really powerful. And we do try to say, when we focus on monarch conservation, we don't want to get too myopic and just focus on, its host plant, milkweed, or just on, producing the most number of butterflies, but thinking holistically about how helping monarchs can help
Mm-hmm.
other butterflies. And so we think about that whole suite of other insects, even birds that can use the floss from milkweed. So bringing that plant back can bring back a lot of other native insects, birds, invertebrates that, prey on monarchs. And there's just this, really cool coevolution of that plant and this monarch. And I really, try to get people to think about that. So if they plant habitat and they don't see monarchs right away because the numbers are down, that they can think about how that connects to this broader need, to rewild spaces to bring back native
Mm-hmm.
plants that we've lost.
So, how is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposing to protect these particular butterflies?
After a 10-year storyline that began with a petition back in 2014, which Xerces was a part of, along with other conservation groups and the late Dr. Lincoln Brower, who was a famous monarch scientist, the service has agreed both in 2020 under the first Trump administration that monarchs warranted protection, but there were higher priorities. So essentially in 2020, they came to the conclusion that they really do qualify, but hit pause. And then because of a legal a judge set a deadline based on a lawsuit. They had a deadline of, really coming out with that final decision or that final proposal in 2024. So in December, we saw them propose to list it as threatened under the Biden administration. So now we're in another, presidential administration. So this is going to be a long process. It already has been a long process. If things go according to plan, we would see a final listing decision at the end of this calendar year. it will most likely take longer as things slow down with changes in administration. But we do think that if this moves forward and a rule is finalized, which again, nothing would take effect until 2026 at the earliest, it would really offer an opportunity to scale up the sort of restoration and protection of habitat in both the breeding and migratory areas and the crucial overwintering grounds. And for the West, that's coastal California. So they did propose to have about 4,000 to 5,000 acres of critical habitat at key overwintering sites in California.
So Fish and Wildlife will be taking comments on their plan to protect the butterflies until March 12th. With that said, though, before I let you go, is there anything, fairly simple that an average person could do to help monarchs right now?
Yeah, I think this is really where, again, no matter where you live, and there used to be a thought that the panhandle of Idaho wasn't good monarch habitat, but great work by the state has shown that while there's fewer milkweeds and fewer monarchs, we can see monarchs, up into the panhandle. We know that planting milkweed is a really great first step, and it's becoming increasingly available at native plant nurseries. You can get it, from neighbors, from friends that have milkweed. Showy milkweed, which is again the most common in Idaho, you can dig up the rhizomes. This is a great time of year to go out and move those rhizomes and then bury them deep in the soil, and that kind of jumpstarts the plants. So there's a lot of opportunities to focus on that plant. Native nectar is another great source, and you can think about all the benefits to other pollinators. We have some really good nectar resources if you're wondering what plants that monarchs rely on. And then another thing people can do is community science. We learn a lot from people's reports of monarchs, and iNaturalist is a great tool to post a picture of a monarch. Thinking about reducing unnecessary pesticide use, especially for aesthetic reasons, in your garden, looking at the label of anything you're putting on, plants or even structural treatments have been shown to contaminate pollinator plants. So thinking carefully about the pesticide use you can control. And then finally, we do have a sign-on letter if people want to voice their support for the Fish and Wildlife Service. You can enter your own public comment, or you can sign on to our letter that kind of outlines some of the issues the RCs thinks are really important.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking time today to talk with us. We've been speaking with Emma Pelton. She's a senior endangered species conservation biologist with the Xerces Society, talking about the Fish and Wildlife Plan to protect monarch butterflies. We will, of course, put information on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
We're more than just podcasts and a radio station at Boise State Public Radio. We're a trusted resource and a lifeline for communities across Idaho. It's up to all of us to safeguard public media's future. You can learn more at protectmypublicmedia.org. Together, we can ensure that Boise State Public Radio remains a trusted resource for you and your neighbors for generations to come.